Welcome to the first episode of Finding Pieces. This season is everything about piano rolls, and today we ask the question, what is a piano roll? You're listening to Finding Pieces, a podcast on pianos, people, and music. This is a piano roll. A piano roll is a roll of paper which contains perforations to represent music performance data. These holes represent the music notes themselves and their durations, as well as some pedaling instructions. Not on this roll, but sometimes you can see lines or text marking to show expressions such as how slow, how fast, how loud, how soft you should play the music. You can think of piano rolls as being alternative forms of music scores or different sort of musical notation. And we see this being used today in some of the most popular music notation softwares such as Liberace, Logic, and MuseScore. And they actually use the term piano roll to describe the method of creating MIDI tracking. A piano roll such as these in their originally created form with their perforations is what operates special kinds of pianos called player pianos. Player pianos are self-playing pianos which encompass pianos pneumatically and mechanically played and operated by foot pedaling in the earlier stages of its development and later containing electromechanical mechanisms. Player pianos come in many different names. They're known as self-playing pianos, pneumatic pianos, and player pianos come in two main variants, pianola and reproducing pianos. I'll come to explain the differences later in this episode. Player pianos are not so common today, and they're mostly seen in the hands of private collectors or museums. But actually the other day, I found one in the middle of a food market in London. These pianos were extremely popular in the United States and also in Europe between the 1900s to the 1930s. Essentially, piano rolls are information storage systems for music designed to be read and played back on particular devices, and in this case, a piano. The majority of today's information system is stored digitally, and the ease of data sharing and consumption online has led to personal storage devices being gradually phasing out. Such as if you own an iPod, this has been discontinued since May this year. If we think back from today on information storage systems for music, in terms of physical items of general accessibility, we can think of CDs, cassettes, and vinyls. All of these are inventions which enable music to be played without the physical presence of a performer, a human being. So, they could be considered as developments of technological process towards automation. And piano rolls, existing over 100 years ago, was before all of this. And the fact that they were made in the form of paper is what makes them absolute phenomenon. Here is how they work in action. The automation idea on piano rolls and player pianos was not entirely a new one. Mechanical music instruments predated the 1900s. We have barrel organs and barrel pianos in the early 19th century, musical boxes and clocks in the 17th and 18th century, and mechanical organs and carillons in the 16th and 17th century. And we can trace further back still to the 8th century. In Baghdad, the Banu Musa brothers, three leading organizers of the Arab science, who noted down that a flute could be played on a rotating cylinder. Although no physical copies of this flute actually exist, it shows that people have been aspiring towards self-playing musical instruments for a very long time.
To create a humanoid flutist, we simply incorporate the whole device in the body of the statue, fix the flute in its mouth and disguise the levers as fingers and adapt it to his arms. A flow of water is necessary for the movement of all the elements, so that air is continuously pushed to the mouth of the flute. The flutist plays the melody as recorded on a revolving cylinder through the movement of levers, the levers being activated by the pins on the revolving cylinder.
Self-playing musical instruments, as those that we've just talked about, came with their own storage systems. Music rolls, made out of various materials such as wood or metal, or a combination of both, such as the wooden pin barrels. It was not until 1883 that music rolls were starting to be made out of paper, first seen by Voltaire and Songs in their orchestrions. Interestingly, the idea of paper in cylindrical form was being adopted in other kinds of technology around similar timings, such as the rotary printing press in 1843, which printed on long continuous paper rolls. And the first perforated toilet paper roll was commercially available in 1890. Paper was light, easier to punch holes through, and cheap. And these paper music rolls were sold with their instruments, first in orchestrions and then in player pianos. When player pianos were first invented, it was a drawing together of a number of existing concepts of mechanism found in all these self-playing instruments. There were two ways in which one can design these pianos. Either you build the mechanism into the piano, or you have a separate component which then attaches itself to the piano. The all-in-one solution actually came first, with experimentations beginning in as early as 1880s. These were circulated in the 1890s, late 1890s, two of them being the Angelus piano by Wilcox and White and the Ariel piano by the Aeolian Company. The Angelus and Ariel pianos were not of immense popularity to begin with because, one, these player piano companies were building these mechanisms which were not initially available or compatible with the best-known piano brands such as Steinway, Bechstein, Blüthner. And so, two, people didn't want to commit to buying new instruments such as these Angelus and Ariel pianos simply for the added purpose of being able to play music rolls. So, what did sell well initially were the pianola, a large apparatus that is pushed up to a piano to play the instrument. The first pianola was completed by Edwin Scott Voltaire in his own workshop at home in Detroit in 1895. In 1897, Voltaire joined the Aeolian Company, and in 1898, Voltaire put up his creature up for sale through the Aeolian, first in the United States and then shortly afterwards in Europe. The Aeolian Company adopted the name Pianola and its design and made more, and business was good. The player pianos at this time, I'm talking about around 1900, both the pianola and the all-in-one option are semi-automated. Yes, the piano does the hard work in playing the many notes, but someone needs to be operating the piano or the push-up through a few hand and foot levers. Most of the rolls that are sold with the instruments simply act as music scores, and they do require the interpretation and human intervention to control the music, much like a conductor. But it's much less of an effort than what a pianist has to go through to learn the piano. And that was how the companies advertised it. The Aeolian slogan, for example, for their pianolas, was so simple that a child can play it. Essentially, these player pianos were a way to enrich entertainment in homes and allowed people who might not have the time or money to improve on their piano skills to still be able to access the difficult high art music. You still need to practice, of course, but playing the piano looked more like a workout on an exercise bike, which can be good on the long run. A further step forward in automation in player pianos came with the introduction of reproducing pianos, pianos which could reproduce the touch and dynamic of pianists. Reproducing pianos were also a response to other contemporary developments in audio recording. Many people know that the earliest recording of a human voice was made on Thomas Edison's phonograph in 1877. It was discovered by researchers in 2008 that the earliest known surviving recorded sound of a human voice was actually made in 1860 on a phonautograph made by Edward Leon Scott de Martinville. More people were interested in developing phonographs in the 1890s, and the introduction of wax cylinders further made improvements to the sound qualities. But the duration of recording was still very limited, at around 2 minutes. At the same time, people also looked into making gramophone records. Gramophone records were cheaper to make and louder in reproduction than wax cylinder phonographs. However, they concentrated on making brass bands and popular tunes because the recording process and the gramophones themselves were considered too crude for the making of serious music. While these phonographs and gramophones were concentrating on making improvements on audio sound recordings, companies that made player pianos and piano rolls explored potentials in capturing performance information, that is, the playing of pianists. The facilities to enable this process on piano rolls were already in place. To make rolls, music editors would have marked and punched out holes according to what was on the sheet music. So all that was needed was something or someone to detect how and where a pianist would have placed a note or marked a note. Picture a normal upright piano connected by rubber tubes to a pneumatic marking machine about 2 meters away. That was what you get if you recorded at the Perforated Music Company in London in those early days. And that was what was happening in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where almost every major roll-making companies were making their own versions of real-time perforating machines and recording pianists. This resulted in many different types of rolls that could be played back on different types of reproducing pianos, as well as companies still making rolls for these all-in-one solution player pianos and pianolas. Even though this technology was readily available, the mainstream of rolls made and sold were just the music itself, and not a pianist recording. In a separate episode, we'll look at the types of piano rolls and the different types of player pianos they can play on. We'll also spend another episode on just looking at the pianists themselves who recorded on piano rolls, what their conditions were like and what they played, and hear some of these recordings. We're now coming to the end of today's episode, and I want to leave you with a final thought. When player pianos first came to be, they were not a means of celebrating innovations in automation. Rather, the automating functions within the instruments facilitated for people to have greater enjoyment about music and music making. And this remained the central focus for the industry as they continually developed their instruments to be the best it can be. First, as storage systems of music notation, to enable people to make music on pianos easier. Second, as storage systems of capturing pianists' performance data. And eventually, third, being a platform where composers could create music without needing to consider the limitations of a human pianist. Understanding the functionalities of piano rolls and how it changed over time allows us to consider the boundaries between human efforts and machine. Automation was, and still is, an aspiration apex for us human beings, and that is true for music and music creativity. So, thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Here's the end, White Christmas Medley, arranged and played by Liberace on an Ampico roll made in the 1970s, played back on a Gregorian Steinway at the Musical Museum Brentford.